good evening, and welcome to this version of the Dan Schnur Political Report. On behalf of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, it's a real pleasure to have all of you joining us tonight. I'm Dr. Richard Downey. I'm the president and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, and I am sure you are in the same situation as I am. It's since our last Dan Schnur Political Report, it's the change in the pace of the change here, both at national and international events, has just been minds blowing and head spinning. So I know you're anxious to hear Dan Schnur help us unpack some of the big events that have gone on in this past few weeks. I do have some news, though, I want to talk to you about, and that is about adding a new option for the Dan Schnur Political Report. Since the pandemic, for sure, this program has been in webinar format. We're very happy because that allows people from throughout the entire country to tune in. But the original program that Dan used to do was an in-person program. So what would like to do is develop a hybrid option where we have both the webinar part as well as an in-person option. And we think that would be a kind of an exciting new option for those of you who, particularly those who live on the west side of Los Angeles. We would host it in an area where you could come and be part of that, the questioning right there, be part of that audience. And then we'd also have the webinar for everybody at home, wherever you are throughout the country or throughout California. So if you are interested in doing something like that, we'd appreciate it if you would respond to this poll and let us know. Would you be interested in again, it would be for a nominal fee, because wherever we go, there's a small cost. It would be just a nominal fee to cover that venue cost. But if you'd be interested, we'd be be happy to see if we can make that happen. Be, as I say, a very exciting dynamic with Dan in the room and you there asking questions. We will get more information to you. So thank you for those of you who have signed up, and we'll get back to you more on that. We want you to be part of the conversation with Dan today, and Madison Alt will be our moderator. So anytime during this conversation, you can go down to the bottom of your screen, go to the question and answer box there, and write in your question. Also, there's a members only session immediately after the one for everyone, where you definitely will get your questions answered. And if you're not a member, please become one. Doesn't matter where you are in the country, it really helps if you become a member, and we appreciate it in many ways. I also want to thank those of you who have donated to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. If you're in a position to do so, we would really appreciate those of you anybody who would want to sponsor a Dan Schnur Political Report for $500, or if you just want to donate, we're really honored and pleased and appreciative of anything you might be able to offer. It's easy to donate. All you have to do is go in the chat box. You'll see there's a QR code. Just click on that. You can donate, or you can go to our website, www.lawacth.org, and there's a button there you can donate. We really appreciate it, and it's very, very meaningful and helpful to us. So again, thank you for those who have donated in the past. And Dan, we're really looking forward to hearing you what your thoughts are on the past few weeks and the way ahead. So please, thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard, and thanks to all of you for being here with us tonight. For those of you in Southern California, I know it's a pretty rainy night, and I hope that together we can enjoy a conversation, even while the weather outside is pretty ugly. Look, as Richard said, we've had a lot going on since we last saw each other. Our January program took place a few days before the Trump inauguration, which means less than a month ago. And of course, it seems like a lot longer ago than that. And you know that Trump's advisors, the term that they use for the sheer volume of activity that the president moves forward with, they refer to the concept as flooding the zone. The idea being that they're going to produce so much news and information that their opponents and the media and much of the public simply isn't going to be able to keep up. And there's no question that over the last few weeks that they have certainly, without any doubt whatsoever, been flooding the zone. The USAID debate, other questions about government spending and staffing controversies, border policy, cabinet nominations, quite a bit else. But rather than trying to boil the ocean, at least in the first 30 minutes, we're going to concentrate, as our marketing and email outreach to you indicated, we're going to concentrate on three particular foreign policy hotspots. And then in the second half of the program, once we get to the bottom of the hour, Maddie and I are going to take as many of your questions as possible. And if you want to talk about Russia and Ukraine, if you want to talk about the Middle East, if you want to talk about China and Taiwan, of course we can. But there is no shortage of other topics for us to engage on. So I'm going to talk about those three foreign policy matters. And then in about 25 minutes, open it up to your questions and observations on whatever topics you'd like to discuss. So for those of you who did see our marketing materials and our emails, you know, we were originally going to use the discussion about Trump's speculation regarding the purchase of Greenland as a way to enter into a much broader conversation about Trump and Vladimir Putin, about the US and Russia and Ukraine and Europe. But rather than talking about Greenland, which is a fascinating topic, but can probably wait until later in the show or another day, instead, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth today provided a much more newsworthy and potentially impactful introduction to these topics for us. And so for those of you who haven't seen the news over the last hours, the new defense secretary gave a speech to the NATO's defense ministers, about 50 of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's leading officers, gave a speech to them in which he outlined the new relationship that the Trump administration sees between the US and Europe. And not to put too fine a point on it, Hegseth effectively declared an end, or at the very least, an extremely dramatic restructuring to America's role as the primary guarantor of European security. He didn't quite say, you're on your own. But here's what he did say. One, most immediately, he made it clear that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO, that the United States would oppose that. Second, although he and Trump in the last few days have talked about a multinational post-war security presence between Ukraine and Russia, in between Ukraine and Russia at the border, he made it very clear, Hegseth did, that US troops would not be involved to enforce any post-war security guarantees, either troops on the ground at the new border or in any other way. And then third, I think most impactfully, he made it clear that any European troops deployed to Ukraine for peacekeeping would be required to be on what he referred to as, quote, a non-NATO mission, unquote. And for those of you who followed the history of the alliance, you know that the importance of that phrase, a non-NATO mission, is Hegseth saying on President Trump's behalf that if other NATO members were attacked as a result of that Ukraine-Russia presence, the US would not be obligated to protect them. So that last point in particular suggests that the US will, going forward, will see NATO's mutual defense obligation in much less absolute terms than we have for the last several decades. And Hegseth specifically said that he had joined the meeting, and I'm going to quote, he said he had joined the meeting, quote, to directly and unambiguously express that stark strategic realities prevent the United States of America from being primarily focused on the security of Europe, unquote. Stark strategic realities, he said, prevent the US from being primarily focused on the security of Europe. Now, there's some who would say, well, the US is focused on Europe security, just like it's focused on Asia security, Latin American security, et cetera. But Hegseth's implication was much different. He said the United States faces consequential threats to our homeland. We must and we are focusing on security at our own borders. And the way a European audience, diplomats, national leaders, and the public, and NATO's 30 plus other member countries, took this as a fairly unambiguous step toward, if not full withdrawal, a very dramatic step back for the US and the European theater for the first time since our entry into World War II back in 1941. And Maddie, I think you'd agree this is a really seminal moment, not just for Europe, but for global geopolitics. And I think it did make sense to start today's conversation by talking about it.
I absolutely agree, and especially because, if I'm not mistaken, this is new Secretary Hegseth's first time addressing NATO in his new capacity in the role. So, I am, I guess, wondering what is the importance of these comments? Like, what does this mean going forward? Where do we go forward from here?
Well, it's the right question to ask. And to be clear, Europe, while they didn't want to hear this, aren't completely surprised. You could argue that Europe has been bracing for this speech since the beginning of the 2024 campaign, maybe since the beginning of Trump's first administration back in 2017. But that hasn't made it any less difficult because over the course of 80 years, for better and for worse, Europe has become so dependent on the US, economically, diplomatically, and especially militarily, that this is a very, very jarring impact, even if it wasn't entirely unexpected. And it's worth noting that the speech came immediately after Hegseth's boss, President Trump, had a conversation with Russian President Putin yesterday for more than 90 minutes, which is a pretty long time for two world leaders to talk. They talked for more than an hour and a half about the prospect for a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. And aside from the specifics of the conversation, what caused so much consternation in Europe is that neither the Europeans nor Ukrainian leadership was involved in the call, and neither European or Ukrainian leadership knew about the call before it took place. And for Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's leader, and his top advisors, they'd become accustomed over the last few years to Joe Biden assuring them that the US would not move on any issue relating to the war without their full involvement. What they saw yesterday and what Europe saw as well is that Trump is very comfortable resolving this issue one way or another with Putin without Ukraine's and Europe's direct involvement. Now, one other complication, Hegseth had said yesterday in separate remarks that it would be unrealistic as a result of peace negotiations. Hegseth said it would be unrealistic for Ukraine to reclaim all of the territory it had lost in the war in a peace deal. And he also said that NATO membership for Ukraine was off the table. Now, these remarks were met with an avalanche of criticism, not just in Europe and Ukraine, but here in the US also, because even many foreign policy experts who are willing to see Ukraine compromise pointed out correctly that giving away these very valuable negotiating chips before the conversation began was just simply not strategy. So Hegseth, in concert with his remarks that I discussed earlier today, he walked this back and he made it clear that NATO membership, that Ukraine's reclaiming of lost territory would all be part of the negotiation. So that's something he worked very hard to correct. But obviously that leads lots of questions for us. And I'll start out by asking Krista to pose one of those questions to all of you. Krista, can we pose our first question? There we go. So based on Hegseth's comments today, but also on his walking back of the points he made yesterday, and given what Trump has said and done over his weeks in office, How do you believe the war in Ukraine will be resolved? Do you think there'll be a treaty that ultimately does work to Russia's benefit, as Hegseth was suggesting yesterday? Do you think it'll be a treaty to Ukraine's benefit, as Zelensky still insists is possible if funding continues, whether from the US or from Europe? Or, as Hegseth indicated today, do you think what we'll ultimately see is an equitable treaty that's fair to both sides? And then, of course, the final option is the lack of a treaty, that negotiations break down and the war continues for the foreseeable future. Let's see what our group thinks. Interesting and not surprising. 67%, 2/3 of our group, believes that the treaty will be to Russia's benefit. 2%, only 2% think it will be to Ukraine's benefit, which is understandable. 10% see it as equitable. And 21%, almost a quarter of us, believe the war is going to continue and that Trump and Putin are not going to be able to reach an agreement in the foreseeable future. So the next important step in this comes tomorrow. And that's when Zelensky meets, not with Trump himself, who's here in the US, but he's going to meet with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's in Europe for the Munich Security Conference, and with Vice President J.D. Vance. And what's going to be interesting to watch is that despite Zelensky's positive public statements over the last several days and his conversations with Trump, Zelensky knows that Vance has been a harsh critic, perhaps one of our country's greatest critics, of US involvement in the war. And Zelensky is prepared for a very difficult day. We'll know a lot more by this time tomorrow what the immediate path forward looks like. Now, when we talk about flooding the zone, as we did a few minutes ago, that means we're talking about a lot of issues moving simultaneously. So putting aside the rest of the world and US domestic policy, the other big news that broke today is on the tariffs front. And Maddie, I have to tell you, if we had done this webinar almost any day from January 21st until today, tariffs almost certainly would have been a very significant part of the conversation. Originally, the president talked about imposing very sizable tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and then walked back partially from those tariffs a couple days later when those two countries made concessions on border security issues. He's then moved forward on tariffs with China. Just this week, 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum. But today, Trump announced what he called reciprocal tariffs. And the gist of this idea of a global reciprocal tariff, the gist of this idea is that the US, instead of having a broader levels of trade and related fees with the entire world, or at least that portion of the world willing to participate, under reciprocal tariffs, the US would customize import taxes or tariffs for every country. And those tariffs would be based not just on what those countries charge on American goods, but also other kinds of trade barriers, so value-added taxes and exchange rates and subsidies and regulations. So essentially, every country in the world will have its trade relationship with the United States reevaluated between now and April 1st, with the presumption being that tariffs will go up for the overwhelming majority of those countries. Now, the combination leads to a much more aggressive effort to open US markets and to eliminate the trade deficit, which is Trump's stated goal. But many worry, not just Democrats, but a lot of Trump's fellow Republicans worry that higher fees on imports into the US will be passed on to American consumers and therefore raise prices and increase inflation. Now, Trump's gamble is that the other countries will decide that the US markets are so big and so lucrative that it doesn't make sense for them to engage in a trade war and lose access to American consumers. And he believes that he pushes aggressively enough that the other countries will back down. But Krista, once again, even though we know that's what Trump thinks, let's find out what our group thinks about how our allies will respond to heightened levels of tariffs. So how will the U.S. or will our allies respond to more tariffs? Option A, they'll open their markets to U.S. products to avoid tariffs. And that's something we saw from India's leader, Modi, after his meeting with Trump today. He announced some tariff reductions as a way of convincing Trump that he didn't need to raise those fees on Indian imports into the U.S. Option B, the other countries will make other concessions not related to trade to the United States to avoid tariffs. And that's what Canada and Mexico did when they adjusted their border policies to try to stem the flow of migrants and fentanyl into the country. Option C, these other countries will reciprocate. They'll respond in kind by raising their tariffs on US products, the concern I mentioned a moment ago. Then D, these other countries, instead of getting involved in a trade war with the US, will simply increase their trade with other countries and decrease their trade with our country. And because those last two options, raising their tariffs on US products and increasing trade with other countries, aren't mutually exclusive and in fact are complementary in some ways. The last option we've given you is a combination of those last two options. So how do we do in terms of the response? Look at this. Only 1% of our respondents feel like other countries will respond to US threats by opening their own markets. And so it turns out that Modi may be a bit of an outlier in that regard. And we'll actually see in the days and weeks forward whether that original proffer from India is going to stand, or whether they too will reverse course and raise tariffs on US consumers. Relatively small number for reciprocating by raising tariffs on US products. 17%, they'll increase trade with other countries and decrease with the US, and that's a real concern. We're already seeing Latin American and African countries reaching out more aggressively to China, and the European Union, which has had a very difficult trading relationship with China in recent years, is beginning those conversations as well. 20%, that's a slightly high number than I would have expected from our group, think that other countries will make concessions to the US on non-economic matters to avoid the trade fees. And then by far the most, more than half of our group, says the combined options C and D. They think these other countries will both raise their own tariffs on the US and increase trade with other countries in our place. So very instructive, very interesting. So as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, these final decisions on the reciprocal tariffs that Trump announced today will be decided by April 1st. So there's about 6 weeks between now and then, in which his advisors will look country by country at the level of trade fees and deciding how the adjustment ought to be made. It is worth, as I mentioned also, remembering that in a similar dynamic, after announcing a 25% increase in tariffs with Canada and Mexico, in just the 2 days between the announcement and the day that those tariffs were supposed to take effect, Canada and Mexico's leaders, Trudeau and Sheinbaum both, negotiated out new agreements with Trump that avoided those tariffs, at least for the time being. So there is a window of opportunity here, I believe, that Trump is counting on, that he can use to pressure, if not all other countries, many other countries, into making concessions either on economic matters, on trade fees in particular, or on unrelated issues to gain concessions and therefore back off on at least some of these reciprocal tariffs between now and the beginning of April. So we're going to move on now. We're going to move on to the Middle East, what has also been huge news over the last couple of weeks. If you think about it, it was only a week ago, 9 days ago, that Trump held a joint news conference in Washington with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And it's worth noting that after Biden gave Netanyahu the cold shoulder at the beginning of his administration, remember, Biden did not meet with Netanyahu for months because he believed that would help make Israel a bit more compliant to US goals. Trump went in the exact opposite direction and made Netanyahu his first foreign leader to come visit, which is a signal that was received obviously very differently both in Israel and in the United States. But in that news conference 9 days ago, Trump announced his plan to have the United States take over the Gaza Strip. And the Palestinians living there, 1.8 million, would be removed so that the US-led effort could rebuild and refurbish Gaza into an international destination. Now, Trump suggested relocating those Palestinians to neighboring countries such as Jordan and Egypt. But the leaders of those countries, like most of the other Arab world, reacted very, very badly, referring to this as ethnic cleansing and even worse. So we'll dig into this more in just a minute or two. But Krista, if we can put up our next question for our group and let them weigh in on this. We're interested not in what you think will happen, but in order to rebuild Gaza, which of these five options would you implement given the opportunity? And I'd ask you before making a decision to look at all five, because while the first two, a temporary relocation of Gaza residents, as some of Trump's advisors have suggested, or a permanent relocation of Gaza residents, as Trump himself has called for, the other option to consider at the very bottom is no change. And by no change, I mean the people of Gaza not leaving, even once the war ends and a reconstruction effort begins. And then the other two options you can see there is, would the region best be served by an Israeli takeover of Gaza, as many members of Netanyahu's government have suggested? You may remember that Israel occupied Gaza from 1967 until 2007, when it essentially gave Gaza back to the Palestinians, which has started the current levels of unrest for the last 18 years. Do you support a U.S. takeover of Gaza? Or finally, assuming that the stakeholders can find a way for the war to end, would your preference be no change, not an Israeli or a U.S. takeover, not a temporary or a permanent relocation of Gaza residents, but rather some type of rebuilding effort that left the current governance and residential structure in place? Lots of moving parts there. I realize it's somewhat complicated, but we only get 5 options to present to all of you. So let's see how good a job our people did of deciphering this. Well, they did a very good job of deciphering. 69%, more than 2/3, do not want to see Gazans relocated permanently or temporarily, and do not want to see either an Israeli or U.S. takeover of Gaza. So Maddie, one of the topics we'll need to discuss in the months ahead in future webinars is what can be done to rebuild the region absent those other 4 options. But that's something that we'll get to in the future. But in the meantime, Trump doubled down this week, even after his own White House press secretary said that they were only talking about a temporary relocation and that no U.S. money or no U.S. soldiers would be utilized in Gaza. Trump reemphasized that he sees a permanent relocation with a very emphatic U.S. role.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I heard him use the word development, as in we're making it completely something new. And I guess my question is, this type of role that Trump is talking about, and basically a conservatorship of sorts in regards to completely taking over, do you think that that's realistic for the Trump administration? Do you think this is something that they're actually going to pursue?
It's not realistic for the Trump administration. And a full U.S. takeover is almost impossible to conceive. I think what many people believe, even some of Trump's strongest supporters, is, as he often does, his first negotiating proffer is an extremely aggressive one. And so therefore he can compromise back from it towards something that's somewhat less sweeping. So it's worth assuming that Trump knows that American taxpayers will not stand for large numbers of their tax dollars, and significant numbers of U.S. troops being deployed there is not something that they would support. But it is worth noting what's already happened over the 9 days since that proposal was made. Trump met earlier this week with the King of Jordan, who offered some humanitarian gestures, but made it clear that he was not interested and bringing hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees into his country. But Egypt's leaders are talking to the heads of other Arab countries over the last several days about a cooperative effort, a pan-Arab effort, in which those countries would collectively take responsibility for rebuilding Gaza. Ever since the war's early days, there's been talk about who would oversee that rebuilding effort. And while many Arab countries and Gulf states have provided immense amounts of financial aid to Gaza over the years, they've been somewhat reluctant to take on that responsibility in a more sweeping way. And the fact that Egypt is now actively engaging with other Arab nations to talk about a collective role that would involve taking on this responsibility, I don't know if that happens either, but it's a much more realistic potential outcome than the one that Trump has been talking about. And then, of course, Israel has to decide on its next move. Netanyahu is under very serious pressure from the most conservative members of his own coalition in the Knesset to end the ceasefire with Hamas, given Trump's announcement. And basically what they say, if Donald Trump is being that forceful toward Hamas, then why shouldn't Israel be also? And we should not underestimate, particularly among Israeli citizens, we should not underestimate just the emotional shock that occurred in that country and here last weekend when the 3 most recent hostages were released. The first 13 Israeli hostages that came home, some of them looked very disoriented. Some of them were very enthusiastic. But it's very clear in retrospect that Hamas very deliberately released the healthiest of the hostages, those who'd been given the most supportive care, health care, food, and so on, while in captivity. The 3 hostages who came home last Saturday, as Gideon Sa'ar, the nation's defense minister, said, he said they looked like Holocaust survivors. And in the state of Israel, a comment like that, which resonated is accurate, brought back some very deep-seated emotions. And so the idea of continuing with the current negotiations with Hamas, given what they saw from those most recent hostages, and their fear of what the next hostages to be released are going to look like after 500 days in captivity, has that country in a much more aggressive mood than they were even a week ago. And so Netanyahu's facing much more pressure. And on top of that, the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post reported this morning that Israel is now considering a missile attack on Iran's nuclear facilities in the first half of 2025. And it's worth remembering how late last year, when Israel's military did bomb Iranian targets, that they were able to do so pretty much with impunity, without a great deal of resistance from Iran's military. And that appears to have given Israel sufficient confidence to think that they may be able to set back Iran's nuclear program many months, if not years, creating yet another complication for Trump, who's indicated that he wants to engage in negotiations with Iran. Now, like Gaza, that's a conversation that deserves a lot more time than we have for today. So it's one that we'll need to come back to in the future. But as always, the Middle East is so many simultaneous moving parts. And by starting out talking about Gazans being relocated and seeing how that relates to broader geopolitical opportunities and challenges, reminds us of the complications that exist in that part of the world. We haven't even gotten to China and Taiwan and Asia, or for that matter, even to the role of the Panama Canal and Trump's interest there as it relates to the Pacific Rim. But I see we're well past the bottom of the hour. So maybe the best thing to do, if you think it makes sense, Maddie, is to put aside Asia for now, know that we'll have plenty of time to talk about it in the future, and go on to our group's questions. What do you think?
I think it's a good idea just because we've got a lot of questions flooding in about the topics we already talked about. So
Okay,
before we vary it any further, I say we go to that.
excellent. Let's do it.
All right. I do want to kick it off with this question just because we just talked about Israel and Palestine. So I want to jump over to a related question. So This is asking about, given the current geopolitical landscape within Israel and Gaza, how realistic is a return to the 1967 borders as a basis for a two-state solution? I know we've talked about that previously, but seeing it now as these factors keep changing, and what would be the key factors in determining the viability for that?
So two really good questions inside of that. One, what is the prospect for a two-state solution that includes a Palestinian state? And second, what is the likelihood that if there were two states, that they would resemble the pre-1967 borders before the Six-Day War? And to take the first question, the broader question first, I think it's always worth remembering, as strongly as not only the Trump administration, but as strongly as Israel's government and Israel's people oppose a two-state solution. Saudi Arabia has made it very clear that the only way that they will normalize relationships with Israel again is in the context of the creation of a Palestinian state. And while polls among Israeli citizens have strongly opposed the creation of a Palestinian state for years and years now, and not surprisingly, that opposition intensified greatly since last October 7th. In the last several weeks, when Israelis are asked about a Palestinian state in the context of a hostage release, in the context of a full end of the Gaza war, in the context of the removal of Hamas from Gaza, with all of those conditions, the Israeli people are much more open to a Palestinian state. I believe that Saudi Arabia wants that deal because they are more frightened of Iran than they are concerned about Israel, and because they would benefit greatly from the US security guarantees that would come as part of that normalization. The United States wants that deal for all sorts of reasons, whether Trump will say so out loud or not, but Republican and Democratic presidents have worked towards some approximation of a two-state solution for decades now. But I think Netanyahu wants it too. And even though his people haven't come fully around on it, I think it greatly appeals to Netanyahu, the idea of him going down in history as the Israeli leader who finally brought peace between Israel and its neighbors. So I think it happens. I don't know how long it takes. I suspect it's something that it's very likely that even if we don't see the establishment of the Palestinian state within the next 2 or 3 years, I think we see a Camp David type agreement that lays the groundwork for it over the next couple of years. And the exact geography of it, that's a more complicated question than we have time for today. I don't think it will be identical to the pre-1967 borders. I do believe that you'll see land swaps both in Gaza and in the West Bank in order to create some geographic continuity for the residents of that Palestinian state. But I do think that within a couple years, we'll see, if not the state itself, the agreement that leads to it, precipitated by a normalization of relationships between Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Thank you so much. And I actually do have a question about Saudi Arabia, so sticking with the same topic. This question is asking what you think of Saudi Arabia's prime minister expressing interest in joining the TPS trade agreement that Trump has previously repudiated.
Okay. Well, Saudi Arabia has played a very, very interesting role, not just in the Middle East, but globally over the last few years. And it's very clear that the Crown Prince sees a role for Saudi Arabia economically and culturally, not only in the region, but worldwide. Although their relationship with the US is much stronger, the Saudis have been in conversations with China and certainly on any number of fronts. And so I do think ultimately you do see that Saudi Arabia believes that there's a significant need for the oil they produce on the Pacific Rim and in other areas of the world. So I do think going forward, TPS notwithstanding, you do see a much more aggressive global economic stance on Saudi Arabia's behalf, and therefore an expansion of its global footprint as its oil reserves, may dwindle a bit. It's looking to diversify, both in terms of product and in terms of consumer.
Thank you. And while we're still talking about trade, I do have a question here that says, what what physical goods does the U.S. export, and where do Meta, Microsoft, and Oracle, and all of these fit in on the topic of tariffs? Because I feel like tech is one of those big things that it's a constant topic in the news, big tech, and I'm wondering where does this kind of fit in with tariffs and the pieces that we import and export and all of that? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so there's in a two-party system, both parties are always going to have very serious divisions. The difference between Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez Democrats and Joe Biden Democrats is immense. And in the Republican Party, the distinction between what we'll call MAGA Republicans, more populist, more grassroots, and the Silicon Valley business leaders is just as pronounced an ideological division. On the grassroots, when it comes to issues like trade, there are deep nationalist feelings, deep protectionist feelings, deep isolationist feelings. And that's what Trump seems to be following now, or at least making the right sounds about, in order to withdraw the US in terms of trade relationships from the rest of the world. But the business community more broadly, and the tech sector in particular, they need those international relationships. So to personalize it for a minute, the difference between Steve Bannon and Elon Musk, both are very strong Trump advocates, but have dramatically different ideas on international economic matters, particularly trade. We don't know at this point where Trump ultimately comes down. Some of his advisors, more mainstream advisors like Scott Bessent, the new Secretary of the Treasury, see tariffs as a way of leveraging other change without actually imposing them to a great degree. But it's not clear if the grassroots populist wing of the party is going to be comfortable with that or not. So we don't know which direction Trump goes in this regard. He thrives from that grassroots support, but he's a product of the business and finance community. So we don't know. One quick last thing on TPS. I switched the conversation to trade for just a moment. TPS, for those of you who aren't familiar with the acronym, refers to not a trade, but rather an immigration designation in this country. And temporary protected status allows refugees from other countries to come here on what's considered to be a temporary basis, although temporary can be many, many years, after a natural or man-made disaster in their country. So we allow large numbers of migrants into this country under the TPS program from Haiti, from Ukraine, from Gaza, from other locations in Central and South America. And I don't know that I completely understand the question, but it's difficult to see Saudi Arabia either qualifying to send its residents here under temporary protected status, or even just as unlikely for them to accept some of these refugees into their country. If the questioner was referring to a TPS equivalent of moving Gazans to other places in the Middle East, I believe that Egypt and Jordan are much more likely destinations because of geographic proximity than Saudi Arabia is. But I can see Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states writing some pretty hefty checks in order to finance that temporary relocation if it were to take place.
Thank you so much. Now, while we're talking about refugees and things like that, this question ties back into Ukraine. It's asking, how can the U.S. dictate the terms of resolution in the Ukraine conflict while at the same time backing away from involvement in and commitment to NATO and Europe?
That's a really, really good question. And the answer is that while Europe has played a much more substantial role economically and in terms of military support in Ukraine than many people expected at the beginning of the war, the overwhelming share of economic and military support from Ukraine does come from the US. And so for the United States to say we'll meet with Russia on this might not be something that the people of Ukraine and many people in this country necessarily desire, but because the US has that kind of leverage economically and militarily, they do have the right to do so and essentially say to Ukraine's leaders, if you don't abide by the agreement that Trump and Putin reach, you will lose all our support. But if you do want to rebuild with our assistance and our involvement, then you'll go along with the terms of this agreement. It's not entirely clear, it's not certain that Trump would come to an agreement with Putin without any Ukrainian or European involvement. And several European leaders have already let it be known how much that prospect concerns them. But given the phone call this week and the fact that our allies were not involved in it, makes a lot of people either concerned or, well, I guess, or optimistic that Putin and Trump will move ahead bilaterally instead of as part of a multilateral discussion.
Thank you. All right, we're going to bring it a little bit closer to home. And this question is asking, should the administration be concerned about extreme anti-Americanism that is sweeping Canada right now?
A really interesting question. Even though the tariffs that Trump had threatened were not imposed, it's very clear that what Trudeau and Canada's leaders, both liberal and conservative, have been able to do is encourage a very, very strong anti-American sentiment, one the country was preparing for what it thought was a shutdown of US imports. They prepared to cut off exports to the United States. And on a less economically directed level, we saw when the national anthem was played at Canadian sports events over those few weeks, we've heard pronounced booing from the audience. And we're now seeing, both from Trudeau and the Liberals, but also from his conservative opposition, some very heightened anti-American rhetoric, which really has inflamed the population. And what it's done, which is really interesting, is it was pretty clear a few weeks ago that Canada's Prime Minister, Trudeau, was in deep political trouble. He had announced his resignation, and it looked almost impossible that his party, Liberals, would be able to retain control of their parliament and the Prime Minister's office. And it looked like Conservatives had a pronounced advantage in that fight. Well, it appears that a lot of Canadian citizens are equating Canadian Conservatives with US Conservatives. And even though it's still very much of an uphill fight for the Canadian Liberals, they've enjoyed a real growth in terms of public support over the last couple weeks because of the cross-border Trump association that Canada's conservative leaders are now facing. I still think it would be a huge upset if Trudeau's successor came from his own party. But conservatives are not nearly in as advantageous a position as they were in mid-January. And that's almost a direct result of Trump's threats on the tariffs.
Thank you so much. All right, we're going to bring this closer to really close to home. We're going to talk a little bit more about our Constitution right now. And so we have a question asking, are we under a constitutional crisis, as some claim with Musk and Doge cutting government jobs and accessing Department of Education and all of those headlines we keep seeing?
Okay. All right, so the idea of a constitutional crisis, the idea that one or more of our branches of government would no longer abide to the Constitution, is something that's been talked about quite a bit over the last few weeks as the number of court challenges, of legal challenges to various Trump administration actions have multiplied. And there's no there is a Webster's definition of constitutional crisis, but there's not an absolutely reliable one-size-fits-all definition of constitutional crisis. So to some degree, it's really in the eye of the beholder. My own opinion, neither as a Trump foe or fan, but just as an observer, is that while the potential for a constitutional crisis does exist, it has not yet happened. In other words, these legal challenges are playing out through the courts, and the Trump administration is fighting against them and plans to appeal others. I believe that the constitutional crisis itself would kick in is if the president and the administration actively rejected the court's authority. Now, leading members of the administration, including the vice president, have hinted that that might be a good idea. But Trump himself was asked a day or two ago about the idea of ignoring a judicial decision. And he said, no, if we disagree with it, we'll appeal, but we'll respect the decision. Now, will he hold to that? There's no way to know. But as long as he does, while the prospect of a constitutional crisis certainly does exist, I don't think definitionally one has occurred until you have seen that rejection take place. So it's certainly a possibility, and it wouldn't be the first time in our country's history that this has happened. Famously, Andrew Jackson, during his presidency, was asked about a U.S. Supreme Court decision with which he disagreed. And he said, okay, the court made its ruling, now let's see them enforce it. Unfortunately, it didn't come to that. But over the years, presidents of both parties have chafed at what they consider to be overly aggressive interference from the courts. We still don't know whether Trump will take a step beyond his predecessors when those disagreements become even more heated. So it's certainly worth watching. I wouldn't discount the possibility for a minute, but at least as of 5:51 p.m. Pacific Coast time on this Thursday night, not yet.
I will say that's comforting to hear from you, but it does directly loop into our next question, which is that the commenters is saying that the Trump administration is bending the political system or democratic political system that we have. Do you think there's a potential for it to break?
There is a potential, no question about it. And I think we could have made the same argument on January 7th, 2021. And the best analogy I heard at that point, and I remember talking about it on an earlier webinar with one of your predecessors, Maddie, is I saw somebody smarter than me draw an analogy between the physical state of the US Capitol on January 7th and the state of American democracy. And what they said in both cases, the Capitol, like the democracy, is damaged, but it's still standing and can be rebuilt. So we've seen this before, and I think the threat is a real one. The fact that Congress is not only of the same party as the president, but so compliant, at least right now, puts an extreme amount of pressure on the judicial branch. Now, this isn't the only time in American history, far from it, when the president and Congress have been controlled by the same party. But what we are seeing now is an unusual level of obeisance from Republican congressional leaders in their rank and file toward Trump. Now, we don't know where this goes next. Will Republicans continue to support Trump no matter what? Well, for example, we're already seeing pushback on USAID funding. Even though most conservatives are very suspicious of the organization, Midwestern senators are upset because the crops that their farmers send abroad through USAID are no longer able to be sent. And other members of Congress in other parts of the country have similarly parochial concerns. So we don't know if this level of loyalty will stay or not. We don't know how the continuing and growing tensions between the executive branch and judicial branch will resolve themselves. So I would say this, at the risk of parsing words, it's worth being concerned, but not yet worried.
All right, well, it's actually interesting that you brought up USAID because our next question is related to that. It's saying, what do you think of Trump's recent executive order, which seeks to dismantle USAID, and where does China fit into that? Will China fill the vacuum of international humanitarian aid?
Well, the second half of the question is much easier than the first, but I'll start with the first just because it's there. We don't know what the courts will resolve in terms of Trump and Musk and their administration's actions on USAID. I believe, as do most people who watch this, that an executive branch cannot unilaterally eliminate an agency like that was created by Congress. Congress would have to approve of it. That said, depending on how the law is interpreted, the administration has tremendous unilateral power to change the focus of an entity within their administration. So let's take another example, the Department of Education, which is what its future is being debated. I don't think that Trump can unilaterally eliminate the department, but what he can do is instruct his appointees there to work much less aggressively on certain things and much more aggressively on others. And I believe the same holds with USAID. So if I had to guess, and it's a total guess, and I'm not a lawyer, as I frequently say with pride, and I'm certainly not a Supreme Court expert, but I think the most likely outcome is the court will say that Trump cannot unilaterally eliminate USAID, but he does have tremendous authority to decide what it does and how it spends his money. So even though it would continue to exist, the degree to which it would continue to exist and what it would do, I think is a much more fraught question. As far as China's role, uh, I believe that as concerned as China's leaders are about the increase in tariffs that Trump has imposed upon them, they love the idea of broader worldwide US imposed tariffs. And they love the idea of the US cutting back dramatically in terms of humanitarian types of aid. Now, it is worth noting, in the interest of fairness, that USAID does fund some very difficult to defend projects. And conservative media in particular has made hay out of bringing up the most egregious examples there. And ultimately, this fight, I think, gets decided when the American people decide whether they're more focused on humanitarian programs that are being eliminated and wasteful and silly spending programs that might be eliminated. But from China's standpoint, if the US steps back, then that gives an immense opportunity for China to step in, economically in terms of trade and also in terms of humanitarian aid and assistance. And in the past, through their Belt and Road program, China has reached out very aggressively into underdeveloped nations around the world, often at the US's expense. What we're beginning to see is the terms of China's engagement in many of these countries. The very high interest rates on their loan, the demands that China puts on them, has made many of the countries that entered into partnerships with China very wary of them. Well, this would give China another chance to engage and strengthen those relationships. So I think they're looking at this with great anticipation.
Thank you. We are going to pivot really quickly to a topic that I myself am very interested to hear your answer on this one. As someone who spends a lot of time reading headlines and on social media, I've seen this video many times over. It's asking about the video coming out of the Oval Office featuring President Trump, Elon Musk, and Elon Musk's son. And Elon Musk's son telling Trump, if for those who haven't seen the video, telling Trump that he's not the real president and that he needs to hush on video and was released. And now this question, son hearing this from Musk himself, and it's indicating a fraught relationship behind the scenes, or is this all kind of much ado about nothing, and it's just, words of a kid that ended up out there online, as many videos do, without really much thought to that?
How about both? So let's start with the premise that we shouldn't be coming to any seminal political conclusions based on what any 4-year-old says, even Elon Musk's son. So we have no idea if that was pre-programmed in his head or not, or if that's just a 4-year-old being a 4-year-old. That said, I think an open question in Washington, one that is so far unanswerable, is if at some point Trump is going to get tired of the amount of public attention that Musk has received. And Trump seemed very content letting Musk take the lead in that Oval Office news conference earlier in the week. But there's widespread assumptions that at a certain point he's going to tire of having having Musk competing for attention with him. I think that's likely, but I'll add one caveat to that. Trump's approval ratings, as most of you have seen, are at an all-time high. Last weekend's CBS News poll shows him with a 53% favorable rating, first time Trump has ever had over a 50% approval, either as a candidate or as president. On the other hand, Musk's approval ratings keep sinking. And so if you think about many of the most controversial things that the US has done here at home, let's set aside Gaza and Ukraine for a minute, the funding freeze, the fight over USAID, the firings of government workers, most of those actions are attached to Musk and not to Trump. And so I wonder if the president isn't perfectly content to let Musk draw some of those attacks and negative publicity for him, at least for the time being. At some point, he probably does tire of the competition for attention. That's just the way Trump is wired. But I think he also may understand the benefits of having some of his enemies fire directed not at him, but at Musk instead. So don't know what Musk Jr. was up to, but it is a dynamic continuing to watch. At least so far, Trump doesn't seem that upset by it, but it's hard to see that continuing indefinitely.
Thank you. I was really curious about the answer to that one, so I had to make sure I got in there. But if you don't mind, I do have one more if you have the time.
Absolutely.
All right. So this one says, will Congress assert its constitutional role in decision making? Why is Trump relying on executive orders instead of leveraging his GOP-controlled Congress to pass legislation?
Okay. Sorry, Maddie, you cut off for just 1 second. Can I ask you to repeat that?
Absolutely. So this is saying, yeah, will Congress assert its constitutional role in decision making? And why is Trump relying on executive orders instead of leveraging his GOP-controlled Congress to pass legislation?
Okay. So it's almost impossible to imagine a Congress of either party asserting its constitutional prerogatives against a president of its own party under all but the most extreme of circumstances. And so even for Republicans who for years have been very angry at Biden's or Obama's constitutional overstepping that they see, they do seem content to back off and let Trump take the lead here, even if it's the kind of thing that would have upset them. And Democrats have the same type of double standard too. They get a lot more upset at Trump's executive orders than Biden's. As far as why doesn't Trump rely on Congress? Well, because there's still a filibuster in the Senate. And as long as Trump needs 60 votes, not 51, to pass most of his legislation, he's not going to be able to pass much of his agenda through Congress. So under what's known as reconciliation, and we can talk about that another day, under reconciliation, he can pass some budget-related items through the Senate with 51 votes. But on most of what he wants to do, he needs more votes than he has Republicans in the Senate. Given just the tiny margin of the majority in the House, Trump's not guaranteed of success in all of his legislative priorities there. From his standpoint, executive orders don't last forever. They're almost certainly reversed by the next Democratic president. But for his purposes, imposing certain policy goals, even temporarily, can meet his political objectives just as well.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you, Maddie.
Well, I guess it's time for me to unfortunately step in here. Dan, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating session, a particularly fascinating session. There's so many things going on right now. I think flooding the zone was a great way to describe it, but I think you flooded the zone tonight, or at least our questioners flooded the zone tonight with so many issues, and there are so many issues going on. I mean, everybody is really trying to catch up and make sense of things in so many areas, and you've helped us do that tonight in a big way. So thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you, and as always, thanks so much to our group for gathering for these conversations. It continues to impress and amaze and flatter me at how many of these really smart people decide to spend their time with us every month. And I'll be really eager when we get to see at least some of them in person in the near future. So thanks to all of you for being with us.
Yeah, thanks, and I want to thank our audience as well. Just to let you know, there was a large contingent that wants to do this program in person, which I think is going to be a lot of fun. So we're going to certainly do it. We need to find a venue, the right venue, and make this all work. But thank you all for letting us know, and we're going to make that happen. But again, those of you in the webinar audience, it will still be there. This is not one or the other. It will be a hybrid. It will be both. So it should be a lot of fun. The dynamic, I think, will be actually very interesting and engaging. So we look forward to that. Madison, thank you again for being moderator, and to Krista, who those of you don't see Krista on the screen, but she's the one that's making all the polling work in the background there and get the questions up to Madison. So, thank you, Krista. I do ask one more appeal from our audience. Please, the link is in our in the chat box. If you're in a position to do so, we would really appreciate any donations you can offer. If you want, especially if you want to sponsor the Dan Schnur Political Report, we'd appreciate it. You can also go to our website. By the way, following this program right now is the members only session. So if you're not a member, please join. We would appreciate it. So Again, thanks to all tonight, and have a great night, and look forward to seeing you all in the members only session. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
everybody.